The sheriff locked a $6 million country club before the ribbon was cut. Inherited 8,000 acres of Texas ranch land, and thought my biggest job would be fixing fences and keeping the water running. Then a luxury HOA built a $6 million country club right next to my property and acted like they owned everything they could see. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I found something buried under fresh landscaping that changed the entire story. By the time the sheriff showed up, hundreds of people were about to learn a lesson that no amount of money could erase. And trust me, you'll want to stay until the end to see what happened when the paperwork finally caught up with the promises. If you enjoy stories about ranch life, property rights, and ordinary people standing their ground with patience instead of noise, take a second to subscribe. There's a whole lot more waiting down the trail. I was standing 20 feet from Cedar Ridge Estates' brand new $6 million country club when Sheriff Travis Cole wrapped a heavy steel chain through the front gate and snapped the padlock shut. The ribbon-cutting banner was still stretched across the entrance. Red, white, and gold letters fluttered over the stone arch that said Cedar Ridge Country Club. Behind that gate sat a restaurant, a pro shop, 2 tennis courts, a glass-walled event room, and a pool blue enough to look fake under the Texas sun. 300 people had come to celebrate it. They had arrived in golf shirts, linen dresses, polished boots, and designer sunglasses. Golf carts sat lined up beside the parking lot like a parade waiting for permission to start. A live band had gone quiet halfway through a song. The catering staff stood frozen beside silver trays of brisket sliders and champagne glasses. Nobody moved. Nobody knew whether to whisper, leave, or pretend this was somehow part of the ceremony. Vanessa Whitmore marched across the gravel toward the sheriff like she owned the ground under his boots. She was Cedar Ridge Estates' HOA president, the face of the development. The woman who had spent 2 years telling residents this country club would raise their property values and prove they had bought into the finest private community in Central Texas. That morning, she wore a cream blazer, a turquoise necklace, and a smile sharp enough to cut wire. The smile was gone now. "Sheriff Cole," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "you cannot lock that gate." Sheriff Travis Cole didn't look up right away. He had a folder open in one hand and the chain in the other. He was not dramatic. He was not angry. He was the kind of man who had served this county long enough to understand that calm scares people more than shouting. "Ma'am," he said, "until the ownership question is resolved, public access to this facility is suspended." Vanessa stared at him. "Ownership question?" she repeated, like the words tasted dirty. "This facility belongs to Cedar Ridge Estates." A few residents nodded when she said it. They had heard that sentence at board meetings, sales tours, private previews, and glossy investor dinners. They had paid assessments for it. Some had bought houses because of it. Some had already told their families they were members of a private country club. Then the sheriff turned one page in his folder. "That is not what the county records currently show." The crowd changed after that. It was subtle at first. A man near the valet stand lowered his phone. A woman in a white hat took one step backward. 2 board members standing behind Vanessa stopped looking at the sheriff and started looking at each other. The investors near the registration table went quiet in a way money people go quiet when the math suddenly changes. I stood with my hands in the pockets of my canvas vest, watching all of it. Nobody looked at me at first. They had looked at me 2 months earlier, though. They had looked at me when Vanessa had me escorted out of the Cedar Ridge sales office for asking one simple question about the eastern boundary line. They had looked at me when her attorney sent a letter accusing me of interfering with development. They had looked at me when contractors laughed and called me an old rancher who didn't understand progress. Funny how fast progress slows down when a sheriff brings a chain. Vanessa finally turned toward me. Her eyes found mine across the gravel, and for the first time since I had met her, She was not performing for the crowd. There was no polished smile, no careful voice, no talk about prestige, lifestyle, or community values. Just anger. "You planned this," she said. I shook my head once. "No, Vanessa," I said. "I documented it." That sentence hit harder than I expected. People heard it. I know they did because several heads turned at the same time. A reporter from the county paper, Lillian Brooks, lifted her recorder a little higher. She had come that morning to write a soft feature about the grand opening of a luxury country club. Instead, she was watching the sheriff close one. She stepped closer to the registration table where my attorney, Rachel McKenna, stood beside a rolled-out survey map. Eli Benton, the independent surveyor, had one hand on the corner of that map to keep the wind from lifting it. The map showed the clubhouse footprint, the pool, the tennis courts, the maintenance building, and most of the parking lot. All of it was outlined in red. All of it crossed the same black boundary line. Lillian looked from the map to Vanessa, then to me. "Mr. Holloway," she asked, "are you saying the country club was built on your land?" I did not answer quickly. That kind of question deserves quiet around it. I looked past the sheriff, past the chained gate, past the stone walls and the fresh landscaping, and the golf carts waiting in a line that suddenly looked foolish. Beyond the roofs of Cedar Ridge Estates, the land rolled east toward my ranch. 8,000 acres of mesquite, creek beds, cattle trails, windmill towers, and fence lines older than half the people standing there. Land my Uncle Raymond had left me. Land I had walked as a boy. Land I had surveyed for the county before I ever inherited it. Land that had not moved 1 inch just because Cedar Ridge printed a prettier map. Vanessa stepped toward Lillian before I could speak. "This is a private legal dispute," she snapped. "The association has full operational control of these recreational assets." There it was again. Control, not ownership. Even on the worst morning of her life, she still could not say the word that mattered. Rachel McKenna turned a page in her document packet and placed a certified deed copy on top of the survey map. "Operational control does not convey title," Rachel said. The silence after that was clean. Not empty. Clean. It moved through the crowd like a cold front. Residents stopped whispering. Board members stopped pretending to check their phones. One investor took off his sunglasses and stared at the paper like he expected the ink to change if he looked hard enough. Sheriff Cole finished threading the chain through the gate. The steel links dragged against the black iron with a sound everybody felt in their teeth. Then the padlock snapped shut. That was the sound that ended the ceremony. A woman near the front whispered, "What happens to our assessments?" Nobody answered her. A man in a Cedar Ridge polo asked, "Can they do this? Can they just close it?" Sheriff Cole looked at him and said, "The county is preserving the status quo until the proper legal parties sort it out." That phrase meant nothing to most of them. To me, it meant the first public step had been taken. Vanessa knew it too. I saw it in her face. She had built her authority on confidence, board votes, glossy maps, and the assumption that nobody would ever challenge the property line under the most expensive building in the subdivision. But confidence is not a deed. A board vote is not a boundary. A country club does not become yours because you spent $6 million pretending it was. The band packed up without being told. The caterers started covering trays. Golf carts stayed parked where they were. Residents gathered in tight groups, asking questions that should have been asked long before the stone sign went up. Who approved the plans? Who checked the survey? Who signed the easement? Who actually owned the dirt? Vanessa stood by the gate, staring at the chain like it had personally insulted her. Her fingers curled around the ribbon-cutting scissors still in her hand. For a second, I thought she might say something else. She didn't. That was when I knew the balance had changed. 2 months earlier, I had been the old rancher asking inconvenient questions. That morning, she was the HOA president standing in front of a locked $6 million mistake. But none of them knew how we had gotten there. They did not know about the orange survey stakes in the grass. They did not know about the old iron marker buried under fresh landscaping. They did not know about Tom Gardner's binder, Rachel's certified notices, or Eli Benton's report. Most of all, they did not know what Sheriff Travis Cole had found in the county records before he ever touched that chain. And that was the part Vanessa should have been afraid of. 8 months earlier, none of us were thinking about chains, sheriffs, or country clubs. I was fixing a fence. That morning started like hundreds of mornings before it. I was on the eastern side of the ranch, replacing a broken section of wire that had come loose after a herd pushed through a gate the previous week. My truck was parked nearby with a toolbox in the bed and a thermos of coffee on the passenger seat. The ranch had belonged to my Uncle Raymond for nearly 50 years. When he passed away, he left all 8,000 acres to me. Not because I was the oldest relative, not because I needed the money, because I was the only person who knew the land well enough to protect it. Every creek crossing, every cattle trail, every old fence line, every survey marker. I knew where things belonged. That knowledge ended up mattering more than anyone expected. I was rolling up old wire when I noticed the first orange stake. It stood near the eastern boundary, bright against the dry grass. Fresh, new, professional. At first I didn't think much about it. Surveyors mark things all the time. Utility companies do too. One stake wasn't a problem. 3 days later, there were 6. The following week, there were 20. Then came the machinery. Pickup trucks pulling equipment trailers, bulldozers, excavators, concrete crews. The activity was happening on land neighboring the ranch, so technically it wasn't my concern. At least not yet. A few days later, I stopped on a ridge overlooking the eastern property line and studied the operation through binoculars. The pace surprised me. Roads were already being carved into the ground. Drainage trenches were taking shape. Construction crews moved with the kind of urgency usually associated with projects that had enormous money behind them. Whatever they were building, they weren't building it slowly. I drove into town that afternoon and stopped at Mulligan's Diner. Small place, good coffee, better information. People talked there. Ranchers, contractors, equipment operators. If something was happening within 50 miles, somebody at Mulligan's knew about it. I found Roy Henderson sitting in his usual booth. Roy had spent 40 years raising cattle and another 20 years collecting local gossip. He knew everything, or close enough. "You hear about Cedar Ridge?" he asked before I even sat down. I shook my head. "What is it?" Roy laughed. "The newest luxury development in the county." That got my attention. He explained that investors from Austin had purchased several thousand acres neighboring my eastern boundary. Custom homes, private amenities, golf carts, walking trails, country club, the whole package. I listened quietly. The more he talked, the more I realized the construction activity I had been watching belonged to Cedar Ridge Estates. When Roy finished, I asked a simple question. "Where are they putting the clubhouse?" He named the location. My stomach tightened. The location sounded awfully close to my side of the boundary. Close enough that I wanted to look for myself. Over the next month, the project exploded. Every week brought new progress. Roads appeared. Stone entry monuments went up. Utility crews arrived. Trees disappeared. Money was moving through that site like floodwater. One afternoon, I stopped near the construction zone to watch a concrete crew finish a foundation pour. Most workers ignored me. One didn't. A heavy equipment operator waved from across the site. "Nice clubhouse you're getting," he shouted. Several workers laughed. I smiled politely. "What makes you think it's mine?" The man pointed toward a massive concrete foundation stretching across the hill. "Because half of it looks like it's sitting on your side." More laughter. The workers returned to their jobs. The joke lasted maybe 10 seconds. The feeling it left behind lasted much longer. I climbed back into my truck and sat there for several minutes. The operator had been kidding. At least I thought he had. But something about the comment stayed with me. People accidentally reveal things when they aren't paying attention, especially around construction projects, especially around boundaries. That evening, I drove the eastern fence line before heading home. The sun was dropping behind the hills. The orange stakes stood in neat rows, some closer than I remembered. Close enough to bother me, not close enough to prove anything. Yet, I parked beside an old gate and walked a section of the boundary on foot. The fence itself looked unchanged. The markers I could see looked untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was experience. 30 years as a county surveyor teaches you to trust both. By the time I reached the truck, I had made a decision. No accusations, no phone calls, no confrontations. Not yet. I would verify the facts first. Because property disputes are like wildfires. The people who rush in emotionally usually get burned. The people who start with records usually win. The next morning I pulled out Uncle Raymond's survey files. And that was the moment this stopped being a construction project and started becoming a problem. Because the first map I unfolded showed something that shouldn't have been possible. And if the map was right, somebody was building far closer to my ranch than they realized. I spent the next week comparing records. The old survey maps Uncle Raymond kept were detailed. Every fence line, every easement, every corner monument had been documented decades ago. I laid those maps beside newer county records and started checking measurements. Nothing immediately proved a violation. But something kept bothering me. The numbers on Cedar Ridge's public development plans looked cleaner than the county records. Too clean. Boundaries rarely look perfect in real life. They zigzag. They follow old agreements, creek beds, forgotten survey decisions, and historical property lines. The Cedar Ridge maps looked simplified, as if someone had taken a complicated reality and smoothed the edges. That alone wasn't evidence, but it was enough to make me curious. 2 weeks later, I got my chance to see the people behind the project. Cedar Ridge Estates announced a promotional event for potential buyers and investors. Anyone interested in the development was welcome to attend. I showed up in my truck wearing the same boots I'd worn that morning checking cattle. Most people arrived in luxury SUVs. That difference didn't bother me. What caught my attention was the scale of the operation. Sales tents, architectural displays, professional catering, scale models of future neighborhoods, large posters showing golf carts moving through tree-lined streets. Millions of dollars were already committed to this project. Whoever was running it believed they had everything under control. That was when I met Vanessa Whitmore. I recognized her immediately. She stood near a large display model of the development, greeting visitors and shaking hands. Vanessa looked exactly like someone who enjoyed being in charge. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect answers. I spent 15 minutes watching her before introducing myself. The pattern became obvious quickly. Every conversation sounded similar. Property values, community standards, future growth, prestige, investment protection. She spoke with confidence because nobody around her challenged anything she said. Then I walked up. "Grant Holloway," I said, extending my hand. She shook it. "Vanessa Whitmore, wonderful to meet you." Her smile was practiced, professional. I nodded toward the construction site visible beyond the tents. Looks like a major project. It will be the premier community in this part of Texas. No hesitation. No modesty. Absolute certainty. I glanced toward the area where the clubhouse foundation was taking shape. Must take a lot of land. We've planned carefully. Again. No direct answer. Just confidence. Interesting. I pointed toward a large development map mounted on an easel. Mind if I take a look? Of course. I stepped closer. Roads. Residential sections. Walking trails. Amenities. Clubhouse. Everything was clearly labeled. The more I studied it, the more familiar it felt. Not because it matched county records. Because it didn't. The eastern boundary line looked simplified. Again. That same feeling. The same thing I'd noticed in the brochures. I pointed toward the clubhouse section. Who owns that property? The question landed differently than the others. For the first time, Vanessa paused. Only briefly. But I noticed. Years as a surveyor taught me to pay attention to pauses. The association controls all recreational assets. Controls, not owns. I filed that away. Controls, she smiled. The residents benefit from those facilities. That wasn't an answer either. I tried again. So the association owns the clubhouse property? Her smile never moved. Our legal and engineering teams have reviewed every aspect of development. Another dodge. Another answer to a question I hadn't asked. By then, I knew I wasn't learning anything useful from her words. What interested me was what she refused to say. Ownership. The simplest word in real estate. The one word she kept avoiding. I spent another 20 minutes walking through the event, listening, observing, collecting brochures. The more I listened, the more I heard the same pattern. Control, management, development rights, operations, community oversight. Everything except ownership. Then something happened that stuck with me. Two contractors stood near a refreshment table discussing excavation schedules. One pointed toward the clubhouse construction site. Crazy how fast that went up. The other laughed. At this pace, nobody's even going to remember where the old ranch line used to be. Neither man noticed me nearby. I don't think either one meant anything by it. But comments like that tend to stay with me, especially when they match a concern already forming in my head. Eventually, I headed back to my truck. The event continued behind me. Music, laughter, sales presentations, people buying into a future they believed was already guaranteed. As I drove home, dust rolled across the county road ahead of me. My mind wasn't on the event anymore. It was on Vanessa. More specifically, on what she hadn't said. Most people who own land say so immediately. They don't dance around it. They don't substitute other words. They don't hide behind consultants and committees. Ownership is simple. Either you have it or you don't. Vanessa had spoken for nearly an hour while I was there. Not once had she clearly claimed ownership of the ground beneath that clubhouse. That realization bothered me enough that I made another decision. The maps weren't enough anymore. The brochures weren't enough. The conversations weren't enough. I needed something physical, something impossible to explain away. A marker, a monument, a boundary reference tied directly to recorded history. And if I was right about where this was heading, I had a feeling one was still sitting out there somewhere beneath all that fresh landscaping, waiting to be found. 3 mornings later, I parked my truck near the eastern boundary before sunrise and started walking. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for proof. Construction crews had already transformed much of the area. Fresh roads cut through the hills, decorative stone walls lined future entrances. Newly planted trees sat in perfect rows, where open ground had existed only months earlier. But property lines don't disappear because somebody plants landscaping. They stay where the records put them. I followed the route of an old boundary described in survey documents dating back decades. The original monument should have been somewhere near the clubhouse construction area, if it still existed. That was a big if. Around mid-morning, I found the first obstacle. A private security truck rolled toward me along a service road. The driver stepped out. "Sir, this is an active construction area." I nodded. I noticed. "You can't be here. I'm checking a property boundary." The man hesitated. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't entirely sure whether I belonged there or not. "Management says nobody enters this area." I pointed toward the ground beneath my boots. "That depends on who owns it." He didn't have an answer for that. Most people don't. The conversation ended there. I turned around and left, but I came back the following day, and the day after that. On the third visit, I found it. Half buried beneath decorative river stone near a newly landscaped slope, an iron survey monument, old, weathered, exactly where the historical records said it should be. For a moment, I just stared at it. The marker hadn't moved. The property line hadn't moved, which meant something else had. I photographed it from every angle. Then I took measurements. Then more photographs. Then measurements again. By the time I returned to my truck, I already knew I wasn't handling this alone. That afternoon, I drove into town and met Rachel McKenna. Rachel specialized in property disputes. More importantly, she was careful. The kind of attorney who hated assumptions almost as much as surveyors do. I spread the photographs across her conference table. She studied them quietly. Then she looked up. "What exactly are you asking me?" I leaned back. "Tell me if I'm imagining things." Rachel smiled. "That's usually a bad sign." For the next hour, I walked her through everything. The survey stakes, the construction, the development maps, Vanessa Whitmore's answers, or more accurately, her lack of answers. Rachel listened without interrupting. When I finished, she picked up one photograph and tapped the iron monument with her finger. "If this marker is where you believe it is, somebody needs to compare recorded boundaries against actual construction immediately." That wasn't a confirmation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. The next call went to Eli Benton. Eli was one of the most respected independent surveyors in the region. Young enough to still enjoy fieldwork, experienced enough that people trusted his conclusions. 2 days later, we met near the site. I showed him the monument. I showed him the records. I showed him the measurements. Unlike most people, Eli got quiet when something interested him. Very quiet. He spent nearly an hour checking coordinates and reference points. Finally, he stood up. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He looked toward the massive clubhouse foundation rising beyond the trees. Then he looked back at me. "I think we need more data." That answer worried me more than if he'd immediately agreed. Professionals get cautious when they see something serious. Over the next 2 weeks, Eli worked through historical plats, county records, monument references, and modern survey overlays. Rachel gathered title records. I stayed quiet. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge kept building. Concrete crews finished major structures. The clubhouse walls went up. The pool took shape. Tennis courts appeared. Money was pouring into the project every day. Then Rachel called. Her voice sounded different, sharper. "Grant, come to my office." I arrived 40 minutes later. Maps covered nearly every surface in the room. Survey overlays, property descriptions, historical records, colored markers highlighted key areas. Eli was already there. Neither of them looked excited. Excitement isn't what professionals feel when they discover a disaster. Rachel slid a large aerial photograph across the table. "Look at this." At first I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then Eli placed a transparent overlay on top of the image. The clubhouse appeared in red, the pool in blue, the parking lots in yellow, the maintenance building in green, and every single one crossed the same line, my property line. I stared at the map. Nobody spoke. Finally, I looked at Eli. "How confident are you?" He answered immediately. "Very." Rachel opened a second folder, then a third, then a fourth. Every document pointed in the same direction. The clubhouse footprint wasn't near the boundary. It wasn't touching the boundary. It was over the boundary, by a significant margin. The room felt smaller, not because I was shocked, because I understood the consequences. Millions had already been spent. Hundreds of residents were buying homes based on those amenities. Investors were advertising them. The HOA was collecting fees connected to them. And if these documents were correct, the centerpiece of the entire development sat on land Cedar Ridge didn't own. Rachel finally broke the silence. "Grant." I looked up. She folded her hands. "This is no longer a boundary question." "What is it?" "It's an ownership problem. And ownership problems involving a nearly completed country club tend to become very expensive. The question wasn't whether Cedar Ridge had a problem. The question was how long it would take Vanessa Whitmore to realize it. And judging by the speed of construction, she hadn't figured it out yet. What surprised me wasn't the mistake. It was the size of it. Over the next several weeks, Rachel McKenna and Eli Benton dug deeper than either of us originally planned. What started as a boundary concern turned into a full review of everything connected to Cedar Ridge's recreational complex. Every survey was checked, every deed was traced, every easement was examined, every title record was reviewed. The deeper we went, the worse it became. The clubhouse wasn't the only structure crossing onto my ranch. The pool complex crossed the line. The maintenance building crossed the line. 2 tennis courts crossed the line. Most of the main parking lot crossed the line. Even portions of the decorative entrance leading guests toward the clubhouse sat on property still recorded under my ownership. The entire center of Cedar Ridge's marketing campaign was built on land that didn't belong to Cedar Ridge. One afternoon, Eli spread updated overlays across Rachel's conference table. "This section here," he said, pointing toward the parking area, "is over by nearly 200 feet. I stared at the map. "How does something like this happen?" Rachel answered before Eli could. "Sometimes nobody asks the right question." That answer bothered me because it sounded true. Millions of dollars had moved through this project. Architects, engineers, developers, contractors, investors, lawyers. Yet somehow nobody had stopped long enough to verify whether the land beneath the most expensive amenities actually belonged to them. Or maybe someone had assumed somebody else already had. Either way, assumptions were becoming very expensive. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge continued operating as though nothing was wrong. The clubhouse exterior was completed. Landscaping crews planted trees around the entrance. Promotional videos started appearing online. I watched one from my kitchen table one evening. Vanessa stood in front of the nearly finished clubhouse, smiling directly into the camera. Cedar Ridge represents the future of luxury living. The camera panned across the pool, across the tennis courts, across the same property highlighted red on Eli's survey maps. I saved the video. Rachel told me to save everything, so I did. Advertisements, website screenshots, brochures, investor presentations. Every public statement, every claim, every promise. Everything went into a growing file cabinet. At first, the process felt strange. I wasn't building a lawsuit. Not yet. I was building a record. There's a difference. A lawsuit argues. A record proves. The more Cedar Ridge talked, the stronger the record became. The more Vanessa promoted the facilities, the more documentation we collected. One Saturday morning, I attended an open house event, posing as nothing more than a curious neighboring landowner. Nobody stopped me. Nobody questioned me. I spent nearly an hour walking through displays while sales representatives spoke with prospective buyers. One conversation stood out. A young couple asked whether the clubhouse would always belong to residents. The sales representative smiled immediately. Absolutely. It's one of the association's most valuable assets. I wrote the statement down the moment I got back to my truck. Another piece of evidence. Another public claim. Another assumption. Weeks passed. Construction neared completion. The financial stakes kept growing. Then the assessments started. Residents began receiving notices tied to maintenance, future operations, and recreational amenities. Some were happy, some weren't. Everybody was paying for facilities that technically sat on land the HOA didn't own. The irony wasn't lost on me. One evening, Rachel called. "How angry are you?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. About what? The whole situation. I thought about it. The easy answer would have been very angry, but it wasn't true. I think I'm past angry. Rachel was quiet for a second. What does that mean? It means the facts are doing more damage than my anger ever could. She laughed. Good. Why? Because patience is making this case stronger. She was right. Every day the project became more complete. Every day Cedar Ridge invested more money into structures sitting on disputed land. Every day public claims multiplied. And every day our documentation became harder to challenge. Then something happened that shifted the balance slightly. A contractor called Eli. Not officially. Not as a witness. Just a conversation. The contractor had heard rumors about a boundary issue and wanted reassurance before accepting additional work orders. That was the first sign the uncertainty was spreading. Questions were beginning to move through the construction side of the project. Not publicly, quietly, the way serious problems usually spread. One conversation at a time, one concern at a time, one doubt at a time. By the end of the month, the clubhouse looked finished. Stone walls, glass windows, landscaped grounds, everything ready for opening day. Vanessa was acting like victory was inevitable. The investors were celebrating. The residents were paying. The developers were advertising. And nobody seemed to realize they were all standing on a legal fault line. Then Rachel received a phone call that changed the entire direction of the case. When she called me afterward, her voice sounded more interested than concerned. "Grant," she said, "I think people inside Cedar Ridge are starting to ask questions." That got my attention. Residents? Some of them. What kind of questions? Rachel paused. The kind that usually come right before someone starts bringing documents. For the first time, the pressure wasn't just coming from us. It was beginning to come from inside the HOA itself. And that made Vanessa's position far more dangerous than she realized. The first person to contact me was Tom Gardner. I didn't know his name when he called. All I knew was that Rachel forwarded me a voicemail from a resident who said he had documents that didn't make sense. 2 days later, we met at a small coffee shop outside town. Tom looked exactly like the kind of man people overlook. Retired, quiet, gray beard, baseball cap. The type who sits through meetings without saying much while paying attention to everything. He carried a thick 3-ring binder. When he sat down, he placed it on the table between us. "My wife says I save too much paperwork," he said. I smiled. "Sometimes that's a useful habit." He opened the binder. Inside were years of Cedar Ridge newsletters, assessment notices, board meeting summaries, budget reports, promotional materials, and community updates. The amount of paper surprised even me. Tom flipped through sections quickly. I started noticing something. What? The language keeps changing. That got my attention immediately. He handed me 3 separate documents. The first described the clubhouse as an HOA-owned recreational asset. The second called it a community-controlled facility. The third referred to it as a managed development amenity. 3 documents, 3 descriptions. 1 building. Rachel had taught me years ago that people who know ownership usually describe it consistently. People who don't know ownership tend to substitute words. I continued reading. The pattern repeated everywhere. Ownership here, control there, management somewhere else. Nothing matched. Tom leaned forward. Nobody can get a straight answer. That bothered him. It bothered me too. Over the next hour, he showed me assessment increases tied directly to facilities that weren't even open yet. Maintenance fees, future operations fees, recreational improvement fees, landscaping assessments. Residents were paying for amenities before anyone could use them. Some accepted it. Others didn't. The dissatisfaction was growing. People are starting to ask questions, Tom said. About the fees? About everything. That was important. Questions create pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Before we left, Tom handed me copies of several documents. Thought you should have these. I thanked him. Then I spent the next week discovering he wasn't alone. More residents reached out. Not publicly. Privately. One retired veteran called Rachel's office asking whether HOA-owned facilities normally required separate ownership disclosures. A widow emailed concerns about repeated assessment increases. Another homeowner wanted clarification regarding long-term maintenance obligations tied to the clubhouse. None of them knew about the property dispute. Not yet. But they could feel something wasn't right. The questions kept multiplying. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge kept promoting success. Vanessa appeared everywhere. Newsletters, videos, community updates, investor presentations. Every message sounded identical. Growth, value, prestige, confidence. What made it dangerous was that she never slowed down. If anything, she became more aggressive. The closer the project moved toward completion, the more public claims she made. One evening, Rachel and I reviewed a new promotional brochure. Vanessa's photo covered the front page. Beneath it was a headline, "The future home of Cedar Ridge's permanent recreational assets." Rachel circled the word permanent with a red pen. Then she slid the brochure across the table. "Keep this." I added it to the file. The file cabinet was becoming crowded. Every claim, every statement, every brochure, every promise. Documented. Preserved. Waiting. Then the investors started asking questions. That surprised me. Investors usually care about returns, not boundaries, but uncertainty changes priorities. One local businessman contacted Rachel requesting clarification about ownership language in several marketing materials. Another wanted confirmation that all facilities were properly titled. Nobody was making accusations, yet. They were simply asking questions. Questions Cedar Ridge should have been prepared to answer. The problem was that answers require facts, and facts were becoming increasingly dangerous. One afternoon, I drove past the nearly completed clubhouse. Crews were installing decorative lighting near the entrance. Landscaping trucks moved in and out. Everything looked finished. Everything looked successful. Everything looked permanent. A resident standing nearby watched the activity with me. I didn't know him. He didn't know me. After a minute, he shook his head. Costs keep going up. I glanced at him. Assessments? He nodded. Every month it's something. Then he pointed toward the clubhouse. Hope it's worth it. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure how to explain that the building he was helping pay for sat on land his HOA didn't legally own. Not yet. That conversation stayed with me all the way home. The residents weren't villains. Most of them had bought houses believing what they were told. They trusted the board. They trusted the presentations. They trusted Vanessa. The problem was that trust doesn't replace documentation, and eventually, documentation always wins. A few days later, Rachel called again. This time, her tone was different, more serious. "Grant, we have a new problem." I sat up straighter. "What happened?" The HOA noticed the questions. Silence. Then I asked the obvious question. "How?" Rachel sighed. "Because somebody inside Cedar Ridge is getting nervous." That was bad news for Vanessa. People who get nervous start looking for someone to blame, and people looking for someone to blame usually end up looking in the direction of the person asking the hardest questions, which meant it probably wouldn't be long before Cedar Ridge stopped ignoring me and started paying attention. The certified letter arrived 3 days later. I found it in my mailbox when I returned from checking a water line near the south pasture. The envelope carried the logo of a law firm I didn't recognize. By the time I reached the house, I already knew who had sent it. I opened it at the kitchen table. 3 pages. Lots of legal language. Lots of confidence. Very little substance. According to the letter, I had allegedly interfered with development activities, created uncertainty among contractors, and made statements that could damage Cedar Ridge Estates' business interests. I read the entire thing twice. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. I had barely spoken to anyone. I hadn't gone to the media. I hadn't filed a lawsuit. I hadn't contacted investors. I hadn't confronted residents. Most of the people asking questions had never even met me. Yet somehow I was supposedly responsible for the growing uncertainty surrounding the project. That told me something important. The questions were spreading faster than Vanessa wanted to admit. I drove straight to Rachel McKenna's office. She read the letter without saying a word. When she finished, she placed it on her desk and leaned back. "How much have you actually said to people?" "Almost nothing." Rachel nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." "What does this mean?" She tapped the letter. "It means they're nervous." Simple answer. Accurate answer. Confident organizations don't send warning letters to people who aren't causing problems. Scared organizations do. For the first time since this started, the pressure wasn't entirely on our side. Vanessa had felt it. The board had felt it. Their attorneys had felt it. The realization shifted something. Not legally. Emotionally. Up until then, Cedar Ridge had acted like the stronger party. They had money, lawyers, developers, investors, public support. Now they were spending legal fees trying to intimidate a retired surveyor who hadn't even filed a claim. That wasn't strength. That was concern. The following week, Eli Benton called. His voice carried the same tone Rachel used when she found something important. "Got a minute?" "Always." "I found something." An hour later, we were sitting in his office. Survey maps covered the table. Historical easement records sat beside them. Eli pointed toward a highlighted section. "You remember the utility corridor?" I nodded. Several utility easements crossed portions of the eastern side of my ranch. Nothing unusual. Power lines, water access, maintenance routes, standard infrastructure. Eli slid a document toward me. "This is what Cedar Ridge appears to be relying on." I read it carefully. Then I read it again. The easement granted limited access rights. Nothing more. No ownership transfer. No development authority. No recreational use rights. No permission to construct permanent structures. Certainly no permission to build a luxury country club. I looked up. "That's it?" Eli nodded. as far as the recorded documents show. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Because if Eli was right, and he usually was, the legal foundation beneath the entire project had just become dramatically weaker. The clubhouse wasn't sitting on land they owned, and the easement they appeared to be leaning on didn't help them, not even close. That afternoon, Rachel reviewed the same documents. Her reaction was immediate. "This changes things." "How much?" She folded her hands. "A lot." That answer stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, because Rachel rarely spoke in absolutes. If she believed the easement issue mattered, it mattered. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge continued preparing for its grand opening. The contrast was almost surreal. Every week, new promotional materials appeared. Videos, advertisements, community announcements. The excitement kept growing. So did the legal exposure. Then another development landed on our desks. A resident forwarded Rachel a digital invitation for Cedar Ridge's grand opening celebration. It wasn't a neighborhood gathering. It was a production. Live music, local media, county officials, investors, real estate professionals, hundreds of guests. At the center of the invitation sat a professionally photographed image of the completed country club. Below it appeared a bold headline, "The Crown Jewel of Cedar Ridge Estates." Rachel stared at the phrase for several seconds. Then she smiled, not because she found it amusing, because she recognized what it was. Evidence. Public evidence. I understood immediately. The larger the claims became, the larger the consequences became. Every brochure, every advertisement, every statement, every promise. They were all helping us build the record. Without realizing it, Vanessa was strengthening the very case that threatened her project. A few days later, Rachel called me again. This time, her voice sounded more serious than usual. "Grant, you should come by." "Bad news?" There was a pause. "Depends on your perspective." I drove to her office immediately. When I walked in, maps and documents covered nearly every available surface. Rachel looked up from her desk. For the first time in months, she appeared completely certain. Not hopeful, not cautious. Certain. She slid a folder toward me. Inside sat the final collection of records she had been waiting for. The last missing pieces. The pieces that would determine what happened next. And once I saw them, I understood exactly why Vanessa Whitmore should have been terrified of opening day. The final records confirmed what Eli had suspected and what Rachel had been slowly proving for months. There had never been a transfer. Not once. No sale. No boundary adjustment. No recorded conveyance. No document anywhere in the county system transferring ownership of the disputed land from my ranch to Cedar Ridge Estates. Nothing. The property beneath the country club remained exactly where it had always been. On paper, in the tax records, in the deed chain, in every historical survey. The truth hadn't changed. Only the construction had. A week later, something happened that neither Rachel nor I expected. I received an invitation, a formal one. Heavy cardstock, gold lettering, my name printed neatly across the front. Cedar Ridge Estates cordially invites Grant Holloway to an exclusive preview reception celebrating the completion of the Cedar Ridge Country Club. I read it twice. Then I called Rachel. She laughed immediately. "You're kidding." I wish I was. "Are you going?" "Absolutely." That answer came without hesitation. Sometimes people reveal more when they believe they've already won. The preview event took place 3 nights later. For the first time, I walked through the front doors of the nearly completed country club. The building was impressive. I'll give them that. Stone fireplaces, vaulted timber ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the hills, Imported fixtures, custom furniture. Money was everywhere. You could see it in every room. The investors certainly could. Groups gathered around cocktail tables discussing future expansion plans and rising property values. Real estate agents talked about waiting lists. Developers congratulated each other. Everyone seemed happy. Very happy. That was the strange part. The closer they got to disaster, the more confident they became. Then Vanessa spotted me. For a brief second, I thought she might ask why I was there. Instead, she smiled. Not warmly, strategically. "Mr. Holloway." "Vanessa." She gestured toward the room. "What do you think?" I looked around. It certainly cost enough. Several people laughed. Vanessa did not. "We've created something special here." There was no doubt she believed that. The problem was that she was focused on the building. I was focused on the land underneath it. She offered to show me around. I accepted. As we walked through the facility, she proudly pointed out every feature. Private dining areas, event spaces, fitness facilities, future member programs, golf partnerships, expansion opportunities. Everything was about the future. The entire presentation depended on one assumption. That ownership had already been settled. Then we reached a large wall display showing the development's master plan. Several guests gathered nearby as Vanessa began speaking. The association now controls more than 100 acres of recreational assets. There was that word again. Controls, not owns. I almost smiled. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to say it. One investor asked a question about long-term property management. Vanessa answered confidently. Another asked about future recreational additions. Same confidence. The crowd nodded along. Nobody questioned anything. At least not publicly. But not everyone in the room was buying the performance. Near the back of the gathering stood a man Rachel had pointed out earlier from photographs. A title insurance consultant from Austin. The kind of person who spent his career identifying ownership risks. I noticed him watching carefully whenever Vanessa discussed the facilities. Not drinking, not socializing, listening. That interested me. Professionals recognize unusual language, especially around property. The evening continued. More speeches, more promises, more public claims. By the time I left, I had filled several pages of notes. The next morning, I delivered them to Rachel. She reviewed everything carefully. Then she leaned back in her chair. "Do you realize what happened last night?" "I think so." "No," she said. "I don't think you do." That got my attention. Rachel slid a legal pad across her desk. Every page contained statements Vanessa had made publicly. Recorded statements, witnessed statements, verifiable statements. Claims regarding ownership, control, authority, long-term rights, community assets, future development. The list was extensive. "Every one of these becomes evidence," Rachel said. I understood immediately. The more public confidence Vanessa projected, the harder it became to later claim uncertainty. That was dangerous. Very dangerous. Then another phone call arrived. This one wasn't from a resident. It wasn't from an attorney either. It was from the title insurance consultant who had attended the preview event. Apparently, he had begun asking questions. Specific questions. Ownership questions. The same kind of questions Rachel and Eli had been asking for months. Questions that led people toward documents. Questions that led people toward records. Questions that led people toward the truth. By then, momentum was beginning to shift. Not publicly. Not yet. But behind the scenes, conversations were happening. Lawyers were reviewing records. Consultants were checking filings. Investors were seeking clarification. And Vanessa kept moving forward, as though none of it mattered. A few days later, Rachel made her decision. The waiting was over. The documentation was complete. The evidence was organized. The timing was right. Certified notices went out simultaneously to the HOA board, to the developer, to legal representatives, to the title insurer, to county officials. Every packet contained the same thing: survey records, deed history, ownership documentation, easement limitations. No threats, no accusations, just facts, cold facts. Then we waited. Days passed. Construction crews finished the last details. Promotional banners appeared around Cedar Ridge. Media invitations were distributed. The grand opening grew larger, more public, more expensive, more visible. Rachel watched all of it happen and never once suggested slowing them down. One afternoon, I finally asked why. She smiled. Because if the truth is about to come out, Grant. She looked toward the stack of notices on her desk. There's no better stage than the one Vanessa built for herself. And for the first time, I realized exactly what opening day was going to become. The morning arrived without drama. That was the strange part. After months of surveys, records, legal reviews, easement disputes, and growing questions, the day itself looked like a celebration. The parking lots filled early. Golf carts moved through Cedar Ridge carrying residents toward the clubhouse. Catering trucks arrived. Musicians unloaded equipment. Investors shook hands. Real estate agents posed for photographs. Everything looked successful. Everything looked permanent. Everything looked expensive. I arrived a little before 10 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the same boots I'd worn most of my life. Rachel McKenna arrived separately. So did Eli Benton. We didn't walk in together. We didn't need to. The documents were already doing the work. Near the clubhouse entrance, a large ribbon stretched across the main walkway. Vanessa Whitmore stood beside it, greeting guests. She looked confident, more confident than I'd ever seen her. That confidence told me something. She either hadn't read the notices Rachel sent, or she believed she could talk her way through them. Neither possibility ended well. The ceremony began a few minutes later. Vanessa stepped onto a small stage positioned in front of the clubhouse. A microphone waited for her. So did several cameras. Residents gathered around. Investors moved closer. Reporters took positions near the front. The entire community was watching. Vanessa smiled. Then she started speaking. She talked about vision, growth, property values, community, opportunity. Everything she always talked about. The crowd applauded repeatedly. Then she pointed toward the clubhouse behind her. This facility represents the future of Cedar Ridge Estates. More applause. She continued. It belongs to the residents of this community and will serve generations to come. There it was. Clear, direct, public. Exactly what Rachel had been waiting for. I glanced toward her. She gave a single nod. Showtime. As the applause faded, Rachel walked toward the registration table. Eli followed carrying a survey tube. I followed them. Nobody paid much attention at first. Then Rachel unrolled a large survey map across the table. The map immediately drew curiosity. People started drifting closer. One reporter approached first, then an investor, then several residents. Within moments, a crowd had formed around the documents. "What is this?" someone asked. Rachel answered calmly. "Property ownership documentation." That got attention fast. Conversations slowed. People leaned closer. Phones came out. The reporter, Lillian Brooks, moved directly beside the table. Eli placed additional documents next to the survey. Certified plats, boundary reports, historical records, ownership chains, everything neatly organized. Then Vanessa noticed. I watched her expression change. At first she looked annoyed, then confused, then concerned. She stepped off the stage and walked toward us. "What exactly is going on?" Rachel didn't look up. "We're clarifying ownership records." The crowd got quieter. Vanessa folded her arms. "Ownership has already been established." Eli finally spoke. "No, it hasn't." The silence that followed felt enormous. A resident near the front frowned. "What does that mean?" Rachel pointed toward the survey map. "The clubhouse, then the pool, then the tennis courts, then the maintenance facility. Each highlighted area sat inside the same outlined section. My property." One investor leaned over the table. "What are you saying?" Rachel answered carefully. "The recorded county documents do not show ownership by Cedar Ridge Estates." The words landed hard. Several residents exchanged nervous looks. A board member stepped forward. "That can't be right." Eli handed him a copy of the survey certification. "It is." The board member stopped talking. Lillian Brooks began taking photographs. Another reporter started recording video. The crowd grew larger. Questions came from every direction. What about the assessments? What about the clubhouse? What about the title records? What about the investors? Nobody seemed interested in the ribbon anymore. Vanessa stepped forward again. "This is misleading." Her voice remained controlled, but only barely. "Our legal team reviewed everything." Rachel looked directly at her. "Then your legal team should recognize these documents." She handed Vanessa a copy of the ownership chain. Vanessa didn't take it. That was a mistake. The crowd noticed. Confidence started draining from the room. Then something happened that shifted everything. A county vehicle entered the parking lot. People turned automatically. Conversations stopped. The vehicle parked near the clubhouse entrance. The driver's door opened. Sheriff Travis Cole stepped out carrying a folder. No lights, no siren, no drama, just paperwork. For some reason, that made it more powerful. The crowd parted as he approached. Investors moved aside. Residents stepped back. Even the board members cleared a path. Vanessa watched him coming. So did I. Sheriff Cole reached the registration table and opened the folder. Inside were copies of the same records Rachel and Eli had assembled. County certified copies, verified copies, the kind nobody could dismiss. For several long seconds, he reviewed the documents. The crowd stood completely silent. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Nobody even whispered. They were all waiting for the same thing. What would happen when the sheriff finished reading? And when he finally looked up from the paperwork, the answer was written all over his face. Sheriff Travis Cole closed the folder slowly. That small movement did more to quiet the crowd than any shouted order could have. Vanessa stepped toward him first. "Sheriff, this is a private community matter." Cole looked at her. "Private matters are one thing. Recorded property records are another." The words moved through the crowd like a hard wind. A man near the front whispered something to his wife. One of the investors turned away and made a phone call. Two board members stood behind Vanessa with their arms folded, but neither of them said a word. Cole looked down at the documents again. "Can Cedar Ridge Estates produce a recorded transfer showing ownership of the land beneath these facilities?" Vanessa's face tightened. "Our legal team has reviewed the development." "That wasn't my question." The crowd went still. Cole repeated it. "Can you produce a recorded transfer?" Vanessa looked toward one of the board members. He looked toward the attorney standing near the stage. The attorney looked at the ground. Nobody answered. Rachel McKenna did not smile. Eli Benton did not move. I kept my hands in my vest pockets and watched the question do what months of polite requests had failed to do. It stripped the performance away. Vanessa tried again. "We have operational control through development approvals and community easements." Sheriff Cole shook his head once. Operational control does not equal ownership. Rachel had said the same thing weeks earlier. Hearing the sheriff say it in front of hundreds of residents changed everything. Lillian Brooks had her recorder lifted. Cameras pointed toward the gate, toward Vanessa, toward the map, toward me. Nobody was here for a grand opening anymore. They were watching a $6 million assumption collapse in real time. Cole turned to county personnel near his vehicle. "Secure the entrance pending legal review." Nobody shouted. Nobody ran. Nobody protested. That made it worse. County workers walked to the main gate with a heavy steel chain. The same gate that had been decorated with ribbons an hour earlier. The same gate residents had photographed for social media. The same gate Vanessa had planned to open with oversized scissors in front of cameras. The chain slid through the iron bars, steel against steel, a sound nobody forgot. Then the padlock snapped shut. For a few seconds, the whole place went silent. Not confused silent, not polite silent, finished silent. The country club stood behind the gate, untouched, spotless, and useless. Golf carts remained parked in perfect rows. Champagne glasses sat on white-clothed tables. The band lowered its instruments. A child asked his father if the pool was closed forever, and the man had no answer. Vanessa turned toward me then. "You planned this." I shook my head. "No, Vanessa. I documented it." That was all I said. It was enough. Over the next few weeks, everything Cedar Ridge had tried to rush past finally caught up with them. The title insurer opened a formal investigation. The developer hired outside counsel. Residents demanded a special meeting. Investors demanded disclosures. The county requested every approval packet tied to the recreational complex. Rachel filed the necessary notices to preserve my ownership claims, and Eli's survey report became the document everyone suddenly wanted to read. Vanessa disappeared from public videos almost immediately. The woman who had once stood in front of every camera stopped giving interviews. She stopped sending cheerful community updates. She stopped using words like prestige and legacy. Within 2 months, she resigned as HOA president. Several board members followed. At the first resident meeting after her resignation, Tom Gardner stood in the back with the same binder he had carried into that coffee shop months earlier. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. By then, people had started listening to the quiet ones. The legal process took longer than the public humiliation. It always does. Some facilities stayed closed while ownership and access agreements were negotiated. Some expenses were audited. Some assessments were refunded or adjusted. Some plans were rewritten completely. Cedar Ridge eventually reopened portions of the complex only after proper agreements were drafted, recorded, and reviewed by people who should have been involved before the first shovel hit the ground. As for me, I never wanted the country club. I never wanted their pool, their tennis courts, or their restaurant with the glass walls. I wanted the records to match reality. That was all. One autumn morning, months after the gate closed, I drove out to the eastern ridge of my ranch. The same ridge where I had first noticed those orange survey stakes in the grass. Cattle moved slowly below me. The old fence line still ran where it always had. The iron marker still sat in the ground, quiet and stubborn. The country club had changed. The people had changed. The records never did. That is the thing about land. It outlasts speeches. It outlasts money. It outlasts people who confuse confidence with ownership. Standing there, I thought about Uncle Raymond and the old maps he kept folded in that metal file box. He had once told me a man doesn't truly inherit land unless he is willing to protect the truth about it. I didn't understand him then. I do now. The loudest person in a land dispute isn't usually the strongest. The strongest person is often the one holding the oldest paperwork.
If there's one lesson I took away from this experience, it's that patience matters more than pride when the facts are on your side. I never won this situation by arguing louder, making threats, or trying to embarrass anyone. The turning point came from taking the time to verify records, ask questions, and let the truth speak for itself. The land never changed, the documents never changed. People simply had to slow down long enough to see what has been there all along. And I think that lesson implies to more than property lies. In life, we're often pressured to react immediately when something feels unfair. But sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm, stay steady, and keep good records. Real confidence doesn't come from having the biggest voice in the room. It's come from knowing where you stand and being willing to stand there with dignity. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where patience ends up mattering more than emotion, drop a yes in the comments. And if you believe facts matter more than assumption, type justice so I know you're still listening. And if you enjoy stories about ranch life, property rights, quiet perseverance, and ordinary people standing their ground the right way, consider subscribing. We got plenty more story ahead, and I'd be glad to have you along for the ride.